Norman had always liked processes because they were reliable in a way people were not. Paper would not forget, margin notes could be relied upon to outlive a human shrug, and a stamped date, once affixed, burned with the comforting certainty of a small sun. This conviction had carried him through years of tepid kettle conversations and the faint, polite noises of existential memos. It had not, however, prepared him for improvisation. Improv, he discovered, demanded the trust he had never been trained to give, trust in people, trust in luck, trust in a janitor's memory and a minor god's appetite for paperclips. And it demanded action that did not look like action to the Directorate of Finality. It demanded messy, human things. They began, quietly, with the midwife. The seaside village was not on any of the department's urgent widgets. It was a place the Atlas regarded as mostly stable, and the scheduling interface assigned a sleek, beige-colored slip with no fireworks attached. Norman, sitting at a borrowed terminal in the department's temporary operations room, watched a grainy feed Gideon had scrounged from a municipal health service camera. The feed showed a small, dim room where a woman with cracked hands and a voice like driftwood-adjusted blankets, while a radio on the side table played the sort of half-forgotten ballad that made you feel both older and hungrier. "She's late, but nothing's flagged," Gideon said, jabbing at his keyboard in a manner that suggested he believed code could be soothed if you tapped it politely enough. The scheduling tick isn't set to trigger an emergency response. Probably a bureaucratic oversight. Also probably a midwife who knows her own business. "Which is why we go in as her business partners," said Rita, folding her hands over a binder that had seen more fight than the department's suggestion box. "We make it look like a regular audit checklists, forms, biscuits, nothing theatrical. The Directorate dislikes theater." Tom snorted in a manner that could be heard as admiration. "Theater's fine if it's not obvious, writer. Think of it like rearranging stage props while the curtain's down." Azra, leaning with impossible nonchalance against a wall where the paint shimmered like a raincoat under a street lamp, smiled as though the world had told her a particularly lively secret. Human beings arrive in messy ways and declare themselves important. They always do. Well, just encourage the mess to look like precedent. Norman felt more akin to a sheepdog than a stage manager. He held a small stapler between his fingers as though it were a talisman. The stapler had seen 3 apocalypses in miniature, a misfired ink cartridge, an interdepartmental scandal about mislabeled memos, and once, a stapled note that saved a clerk's job. It felt like something worth bringing along. Gideon, with a flourish that involved a spool of parody lines and a cautious mutter about temporary token masks, created a gap in the scheduling fog. For 5 minutes, the reality scheduling daemon would register the village as protected for non-standard health occurrence human variants allowed. It was a lie, technically, though it looked very much like bureaucracy doing what it had always promised, bending to human need when necessary. The lie, everyone agreed, had to be indistinguishable from an honest precedent. The room they entered smelled faintly of sea salt and antiseptic. The midwife Marta, the camera caption said, greeted them as if she enjoyed odd visitors, audit team. She said, reading their faces like a book she had begun and lost and picked up again. "Make it quick. I'm busy delivering a perfectly unscheduled miracle." Norman's knees made an involuntary sound. "We're not here to approve protocols. We're here to offer a blanket, legal sounding, for paperwork." Marta laughed, the sound like a sieve. "You don't have to convince me, you have to convince them." She nodded toward the radio, where the bollard had softened into a lullaby. The delivery was itself a small political act. Marta had no time for a clipboard. She had midwifery in her hands and song in her jaw. She called for a towel that wasn't on the table. Aria, newly off the wagon of officiousness and remarkably adept at improvisation when the stakes were human, produced a towel from her bag with the same economy she applied to memos. Rita handed over biscuits without comment. Tom hummed a tune he did not know he knew. When the baby came, It was less of a birth and more of a declaration. The room paused, as rooms do when something unexpectedly right happens. Norman felt his old clerkish certainty warp into something unfamiliar and blindingly, stubbornly real. This mattered. It might have been the clean scream, the way the midwife's hands steadied like two pillars, or perhaps the radio's bollard spilling out something softer than it had any right to. Gideon, behind a folding screen, recorded testimony on a battered recorder they had labeled Exhibit Human Goodness Non-Standard. Outside the 5-minute reprieve, a streetlight in a neighboring town hiccuped and resumed its strict regularity. Inside the reprieve, Marta folded the new life in a towel like a secret and handed it to its parent, who smelled of salt and old jokes. Norman, who had never in his life held a baby without a form attached, found his hands trembling. The improvised was incontrovertible. Admissible, Rita asked quietly. Gideon blinked, as though still basking in the success of his hack. Technically, yes. The log shows human intervention in a plausible pattern. Narrative arc is intact. It will survive cross-examination if it's not presented as a performance. Then we don't present it as a performance, Aria said, and Norman noticed the red pen in her hand had acquired a softer tilt. They moved on like people who had finally found their reason for running. The teacher in a rainy classroom had no idea she was an exhibit. She was merely a woman named Lorna who had kept her umbrellas in neat rows and her scolding soft, because children cried and teachers bled through kindness as a matter of professional hazard. The classroom smelled of wet coats and chalk. A child with knees scabbed from too many real games of grabbing joy paced the edge of a lesson on the layers of the earth which, given a child in the front row who had once watched his father leave and never return, seemed suddenly irrelevant. Lorna extended 15 seconds, too many for a child who couldn't quite answer a math question. Those 15 seconds were small currency. They let a hand unclench, a breath slow, an attention that might have been lost be found for a heartbeat. Gideon promised another 5-minute scheduling reprieve and gave it a soft, almost apologetic shift in a terminal hum that made a server cough like a polite elder. Norman sat with a notebook, pretending to check boxes while his eyes took in the child's small, exacting face. The child's answer came, wrong but held up like a lantern. Lorna smiled the way only teachers who had failed, and then tried again smile, as if the world might one day remember the kindness. "That's admissible as an unplanned act of compassion," Tom muttered. "It smells faintly of script, but the sincerity is sharp enough to cut." "Don't say that out loud," Aria said, and the way she said it made "don't" sound like a small prayer. Back at the department, Prophet Alice's voicemail queue was a thing of architectural cruelty folded menace, infinite hold music in a key designed to flatten resistance. Recorded operators that said, "Your call is important to us," with a tone that assumed the opposite. Norman sat with the phone, listening to a loop that had convinced multiple oracles that silence was a policy. He pressed a key Gideon had assigned to a phantom administrator permissions set, and the line popped free like a cork from a too-tight bottle. "Finally," Alice said, and it felt as though a window had been opened in a room that had been full of boxes. "We need a brief reading," Norman said, "because that is what bureaucrats say when they are pretending to be poets." Alice read. She read like a woman who had been waiting for an audience and also wondering why the audience was entirely made of people carrying clipboards. Her voice was dry as toast, lovely as an ornate scandal. In under 90 seconds, she managed to say something that was both a prophecy and a footnote. People were, unfailingly, terrible at being tidy. They also, uncannily, performed small acts of repair when given the chance. The line recorded, Gideon saved, Clara supplied biscuits, and Norman felt the shape of the thing they were making begin to look like a precedent rather than a performance. The interventions piled. A neighbor in a city alley rescued a stray dog that belonged to a child who had recently lost a father. A librarian refused to find a late book returned with a pressed flower. A mid-level hospital technician rigged a ventilator's alarm until the right specialist arrived. Each required a bit of finesse and a certain cowardly grace. Do not make it look rehearsed. Do not reveal the 5-minute reprieve. Let human tenderness appear as if it had always been the plan. Azra provided help in the way a being with celestial secondment provides, elliptical, mischievous, and always with a price that was not money. "I will make sure the timing aligns," she told Norman as they watched a small village's town clock slow its hands by a breath. "But you will owe me a paperclip chain fashioned out of the laughter of at least 3 different languages." "We have a supply of laughter lying about the office?" Norman asked, which was the sort of question only someone who had never tried to barter for celestial favors would ask. "It's in Clara's biscuit tin," Azra said, and then proceeded to explain how laughter could be harvested in a manner that involved 3 office jokes, a rhymed apology, and a copy of an old, terribly tedious hymn. The team operated in a rhythm that did not resemble the department's usual meter of memo and stamp. It was improvisatory and ragged. Rita moved through union contacts with the efficiency of someone who had once organized minor deities and now applied the same blunt force to human kindness. Mir, a knock in his overalls, had a series of keys and small relics he claimed belonged to the early days, a phrase that meant he had once cleaned halls that were older than certain continents' fondest myths. He produced a brass mop handle that, when struck, produced a tone that seemed to calm an overexcited filing cabinet. "Works with ordnance," he said simply. Sergeant Hall Brooks, who spent his days being the immovable object to the department's immovable subjects, now acted as a kindly bouncer. He ushered a midwife here, held a gate there, and once, with a whisper of poetry tattooed at his wrist, read 2 stanzas that made a nervous clerk decide not to send a hateful memo. All the while the directorate watched, not with eyes, exactly, but with an architecture of suspicion. Auditor Primus emissaries wandered corridors and coughed at the teapot. They asked polite, killing questions. How can you be sure this was not staged? What guarantees remove the possibility of theatrics? Is precedent being manufactured to suit a narrative of sentimentality? The words were polite as meal invitations but sharp as scalpels. Norman discovered, in a way that ink never taught, that conviction was a contagious thing. The more he saw people respond to actual need without waiting for permission, the more he felt the peculiar bloom of authority that does not come from a stamp, but from action. Aria, once a walking policy memo with a hairnet for a brain, found herself writing margin notes that said things like, "Allow this on compassionate grounds in a script Dawsonsk bureaucrats would have once considered treasonous. If the directorate calls this staged," Tom said one evening, watching Gideon print out a list of signatures like a small, sanctified jury, "we'll be accused of theatricality. And they'll be right, we'll have staged it. The question is whether authenticity can tolerate a stage manager. People will say anything in court," Rita said. "They say worse all the time. We need a narrative that cannot be easily undermined, testimony, live witnesses where possible, and evidence that shows the outcomes changed." Outcomes mattered more than intent. That was the paradox they discovered. The child who learned to count again mattered more than the hack that bought them the extra minute. The baby who arrived alive mattered more than the small deceit that wrapped its timing. Even Auditor Primus, who kept the cosmos from unseemly improvisation for reasons the universe had once needed, would have to concede that results change reality. They rehearsed their presentation less like thespians and more like people trying to teach a very old machine to bend. Gideon produced printed logs, time-stamped with careful falsifiable gaps that made them look more like legal appendices than conjurers' receipts. Clara supplied witnesses who would stand and swear to clumsy kindnesses, mitter. Enoch offered, when asked, to testify on the solidity of mop tone acoustics and the way a brass strike unseats a filing cabinet's anxiety. Azra delivered a short treatise about the unpredictability of cosmic probabilities in exchange for a paperclip chain constructed from office lata. And Prophet Alice Cantankerous, untidy, real agreed to read a short piece in the public hearing. "I'll say what I see," she told Norman. "I'm not for hire, I'm for truth. If you stage it well, it might be indistinguishable from real life, but it'll not help you pretend. It'll help by telling the truth of what I cared enough to say." "That's the point," Norman said. "The truth isn't neat. It's messy. It needs to be admissible." As if the cosmos enjoys a dramatic prelude, the directorate announced a formal inspection the morning they had finished printing what Gideon titled the evidence packet, a compendium of ordinary heroics. An air of profoundly official inconvenience swept the department. The inspection would be public. There would be seats and microphones and a panel that loved precedent the way some people love rare stamps. The whole office suddenly smelled like boiled tea, metal, and the faint scent of courage. Auditor Primus, through a voice that sounded like 1,000 stamps pressed at once, issued the terms: "Present your evidence in a public hearing, and let the world judge whether your acts of kindness are genuine or merely theatrical." "Precedent must be protected," Primus intoned. "If exceptions are made on the basis of theatrics, the door to chaos opens." Norman found, in the quiet after the announcement, that his old terror of being found useless had softened into something else. An awareness that being brave did not always require bluster. Sometimes it required arranging biscuits in a tin and coaxing a reluctant prophet to speak. Sometimes it required stealing 5 minutes from a server and using it to make someone feel like they mattered. They had one night before the inspection to ensure witnesses would not be intimidated, to rehearse testimony without making it sound rehearsed, to arrange for live feeds to be both authentic and technically robust. It was a small, stupidly enormous thing. Norman lay awake thinking about signatures and the way a midwife's hands bent around a new life, and he could not tell whether the thing sitting in his chest was fear or the thin, bright line of hope. At dawn, the department looked like a place that had been both raided and blessed. Sticky notes fluttered like confetti. Clara put out a tin of biscuits labeled for evidence and other delicate matters. Mr. Enoch polished the brass mop handle until it hummed benevolently. Aria, for the first time Norman had ever seen, smiled in a way that loosened the rigid fold at the corner of her mouth. "We're improvising law now," Gideon said as he watched the final print spinner churn. "This is what verbs look like when they try on a tie." "Then wear it well," Rita said. "Because remember, this isn't about whether we staged kindness. It's about whether kindness is useful enough to be preserved under statute." Norman, clinging to a stapler like a compass, felt something shift. He had spent his life learning the security of rules. Now he was learning the vulnerability of action. In the end, it was not a binary of right or wrong, but of whether people would stand and speak for one another. They filed, at last, their collection of small, undeniable things: recordings of births, classroom notes, testimonies from a rescued dog wrangler and a librarian, Prophet Alice's sharp reading, Enoch's mop-tone notes. Each item was in isolation unimpressive. Together they hummed a tune louder than any statute. As the doors closed on their hurried shove of evidence, and the department prepared for what the directorate would call an unconventional review, Norman realized that they had learned something essential: that bureaucracy could be a scaffold for mercy if people were willing to climb onto it and do the improbable work of carrying. He also realized, with the practical dread of a man who once failed an exam and then built his life around avoiding failure, that the directorate might still call it theatrical. The last thing that happened before the inspection was an ordinary thing. Norman walked to the window and watched the city hiccup, a streetlight pause, a fountain burst, a bus stop where 3 passengers began to sing the wrong chorus of a pop song in perfect harmony. It was not the end of the world. It was an odd, slightly askew morning where the universe showed its spare parts and its surplus generosity. He turned away and found Arya beside him with the red pen resting against her palm like a strange, promised sword. "If we lose," she said, "do you know what we'll have done at least? We'll have tried to make the system care." Norman thought of the baby wrapped in Marta's towel, of Lorna smiling at a child, of Prophet Alice's thin, loud truth, and the brass mop handle. He thought of all the small things that had suddenly, absurdly, become important enough to require paperwork. "Then let them call it theatrical," he said. "But well, ask the audience to remember who the theater was for." The department filed into the hearing room like a modest army. Cameras clicked. Microphones protruded like curious beetles. The public, as the directorate had determined with statistical correctness, would watch. Primus would sit with the implacable air of a man who had once been required to slam the universe's brakes. The inspection would be the moment of truth, and in the small, cramped space where preparations turned to prayer, Norman wrote a single line in the margin of the evidence packet. For the messy, ordinary things that prove we were worth saving. He did not know whether that would be persuasive. He only knew the truth of it in the way truth is sometimes only felt, in the fistful of biscuit crumbs, in the brass hum of a mop, in the hush after a baby cries and the world remembers how to be held. They filed into the room. The inspection began. Outside, a clock somewhere decided it liked being 15 seconds slow on Tuesdays forevermore. And somewhere else a village decided to hum in 3-part harmony for reasons it would invent later. The world, modestly and absurdly, continued to be worth small interventions. The public hearing would decide whether those small things could become precedent. Norman straightened his tie, which was crooked in the way courage so often is, and prepared to speak for the messiest, most compelling case of all, human hands doing their imperfect best. And the directorate, who had once argued against improvisation like a doctrine, prepared to listen with the suspicious, reluctant interest of an institution learning it might still be useful to the living. It was, in a phrase Norman had always considered deeply unromantic, time to file. The inspector's gavel had not yet fallen when someone in the back of the room sneezed at an inopportune volume. Norman counted it as a good omen. The news that a person might be more than the sum of his file numbers arrived, as most transformative bureaucratic phenomena do, with an inconveniently timed cup of tea, and the faint sound of a continent swallowing. It had been an ordinary morning. Norman had arrived, read the memos in order of marginalia, fed the kettle a pinch of bureaucratic optimism, and waited for the communal teapot to produce something barely hot enough to qualify as tea. The department hummed with its usual workaday wastes of eternity. Stamped memos clattered like rain. The elevator emitted its peculiar polite cough, and the tepid sky outside the windows was the color of old receipts. By 10:30 they had a meeting room and an agenda. By 11 the agenda had been chewed like the corner of a paperclip and spat onto the table with comments in the margins. The meeting emergency reconciliation of irregular protocols. The header declared in capitals that were too adamant to be gentle filled up in the way a conference call picks up passengers. People drifted in, took their seats, and assumed the appropriate posture of somebody waiting for somebody else to make a policy-shaped sacrifice. Tom Chalk arrived late, of course. It was his art to make entrances seem accidental when they were carefully timed gestures. He shrugged out of his coat, revealing a tie with a pattern of little hourglasses that seemed to grin. The little smile he carried was not meant to be comforting. He set his coat down and took out a notebook, so battered its cover had the sentimental dignity of a relic. When he placed it on the table, the room's small noises seemed to hush, as if the notebook had swallowed some of the air. "Right?" said Rita, closing her binder with the decisive thwack of someone used to sealing fates with staples. "People. We have to get all the testimony we can. We need human examples. We need people to step up and say what the cost of sticking to rule is." Norman's hands were busy with the tiny stapler he carried as if it were a comfort talisman. They tapped marginalia into existence, small, tidy marks that made the meeting look like it had always been supervised by someone with a neat heart. He felt his throat close, as if a footnote were attempting to lodge itself there. He had been waiting his entire career to be both invisible and absolutely essential. Today the two demands clashed like improperly filed forms. Tom's voice cut through in a way that did not attempt to be polite. "I have something to say." The room turned toward him the way a clock face turns toward noon. Tom's eyes were sudden and raw, like a coin someone had polished, and then dropped in the gutter. He opened his notebook and did not start with the kind of abstract prelude that bureaucrats favor. He began with the admission of a particular doing. "When I was 22, he said, young, keen, and certain that I could tidy the future, I suppressed a prophecy." The words, simple as they were, had a weight because Tom did not use them for dramatic effect. He said the sentence as an auditor would say an irregularity, plainly, and then with the careful addition of numbers, dates, signatures. He told them about a small prophecy, nothing cosmic in scale, according to any reasonably applied definition, about a farmer who would find a way to save a crop with a ridiculous mixture of willow bark and an unlikely lullaby. The prophecy was not world-ending, it was life-making. Tom, convinced that alterations in the public ledger should be neat, untroubled, and predictably repeatable, had redacted the prophecy from the public index and tucked it into a private drawer in his heart where it remained unreadable, tidy, and shameful. "It was an error in judgment," Tom said. "I thought I was protecting the system. I did not see that the system needed protecting from me." He looked at Norman. Norman could do nothing but breathe, which is often an underrated bureaucratic act. "Why are you telling us now?" Norman asked, because Norman's questions were always serviceable, precise, bound by the grammar of procedure. Tom placed a hand on the notebook, as if the cover might otherwise fly open and reveal several more sins. Because there are people who will say we need precedent. There are people who will say that to fix this you must be neat. I'm telling you now, because neatness isn't always possible. Sometimes the only right cataloging is the one that admits a smudge. The room was quiet for a long time. Even the tepid kettle in the kitchenette seemed to be listening. In bureaucracies, silence is rarely passive. It is a conditioned reflex by thousands of officials learning to wait for formal instruction. Tom's confession did more than shock. It unlatched something like a possibility. It allowed others their own simplicity of truth. People have a strange and immediate respect for the person who can say the thing everyone else thought, but could not sanction. It fell to Rita to turn the intimacy of confession into an instrument of institutional change. She had been in the department long enough to have cared for and chastised the machinery inside. She had an eye for a ledger's smell and an instinct for where evidence likes to hide under worn tabs, in margins where clerks had once doodled gods, and inside folders so labeled old that the label itself was an act of censorious forgetfulness. The archives, as it happened, had a basement that tasted of dust and paper, and Rita wore that dissent like armor. She crouched under the dim light with a little headlamp, the beam of her light bright as a resolve. She read the script of past clerks as if they had left apologies tucked between rows of headings. They're curled like an appended apology. She found a file stamped suppressed and later annotated in a handwriting she recognized as belonging to a long-dead supervisor who had once been merciful enough to be cunning. The document was an administrative report about a small mishandled intervention decades earlier. In the margin, a note had been scrawled, "Postponed for humanitarian reasons, see separate annex." That annex, when Rita found it, contained a transcript of a hearing and signatures that cleared Norman's family of a blemish they'd carried like a secret. Norman's breath left him in a sound like a punctuation mark. "They erased it to keep statistics neat," Rita said softly when she brought it back to the meeting room. "They thought numbers mattered more than the people those numbers were about. The evidence had a quality that raw procedure, for all its plainness, sometimes lax, it was human shape. It carried handwriting, the faint smell of tobacco, a butter stain at the corner from someone who must have read it while eating breakfast in haste. These were the inconvenient residues of real life. They mattered because they were not abstract, and bureaucracies, which often prefer abstraction, are oddly susceptible to being undone by particularity. Norman held the transcript as if it weighed more than paper should. He had grown up learning that his family's disgrace was something he could fix by being impeccable. This document proved that sometimes disgrace is manufactured by systems terrified of softness. The revelation made him dizzy with relief. "You need to bring this forward," Rita said, because Rita did not believe in the consolations of small victories hidden in basements. "We bring this forward and we present it at the review. We show precedent. We show that humanity has been the adjective under which other people once acted." Arya Vost sat very still during the later part of the meeting. Her fingers twitched near the red pen, as if the instrument were a liturgical object best used in moments of confession and excommunication. Normally, Arya favored the subtle authority of policy memos. She wore rules as some people wear armor. But there is a sort of remorse so old it becomes part of the measure of a person. Arya had delayed a minor apocalypse once, when she had been younger and certain that rules had to exist in order to justify tenderness. When it came her turn, she did something the department was not known to do. She spoke from the first person. "There was a time," she said, "when I broke a rule to save one person. It cost me. I was moved to a function where I could keep my hands clean. Clean hands are a kind of career, but they are not always a kind of goodness." Her voice softened, and the red pen trembled in its clip like a bird on a wire. "We can recite the charter until the ink runs dry. But what do we do when our charters have charters? When our procedures preserve an abstraction at the cost of the actual people they were meant to protect? I say this as someone who learned that compromise is both necessary and a little like losing a favorite glove." This admission carried weight because Arya had built her life on the reliability of forms. For her to step from behind the shield of policy into exposure was to offer herself as a precedent. The room understood the gesture the way a courtroom understands testimony, a hand raised, a voice giving itself a sanction. Outside the immediate circle, the mid-level clerk Jarox Kellen, whose ambition had been paper cut into a neat, self-satisfied grin, had expected to be elevated for his initiative. He had thought of himself as a vector for efficiency, a sensible addition to the directorate's future. But human systems, even bureaucratic ones, have ways of enacting poetic justice. Gideon, with his obsession for log files, had been quietly tracing signatures. He reflected the forgeries under a projector so that they appeared big and absurd on the wall like watermarks, enlarged to grotesque size. "You tried to escalate the protocol illegally," Gideon said, with the clinical delight of someone reading the log file from inside the machine that had recorded how it was broken. "You forged endorsements, miswritten memos, and attempted to lock the revocation queue. You acted as if the department were a ladder, and you had a right to climb it by stepping on other people's toes." Jarox's face contracted when the projector hummed his signatures into light. "I did what I thought best. I thought it'd be rewarded. The department's machinery is not entirely unkind. It has procedures for punishment, but it also has statutes for rehabilitation, a mixture of censure, reassignment, and required service hours in the compassion unit. The punishment meted out to Jarox was equal parts procedural and human. He was demoted, yes, but he was also assigned to work under Rita for a period of restorative labor, filing claims, listening to grievances, and being forced to meet the people his ambition had used as means. When Jarox left the room, he was quieter than the moment before, and there was a kind of humility in the way he folded his hands. The room exhaled. A department is essentially a machine for turning private ambition into public order. Sometimes it corrodes ambition, sometimes it redirects it. The team's reckonings were not only about justice, they formed a narrative thread. Each admission, each discovery, added a color to the tapestry they'd been drafting in haste. Tom's confession proved that even those who once thought themselves guardians of the ledger could err. Writer's uncovered file proved that the department had, at times, preferred tidy numbers over messy humans. Aria's public appeal proved that even rule keepers sometimes risk their careers for a person. Gideon's forensic patriotism made the mid-level clerk's betrayal visible and therefore manageable. Norman, who had always believed that his value was found in meticulous annotation, discovered that his courage could be an action rather than a marginalia. These shifts did something crucial. They imbued the evidence the team needed with moral texture. Auditor Primus, being the embodiment of the directorate, was not someone who could be reasoned with by anecdote alone. It took precedent, signed affidavits, and the kind of human testimony that could not be easily caricatured as obstructionist sentimentality. The testimony, rendered plaintive by the presence of butter-stained annexes and a former supervisor's apology, was now forming a document that could alter the trajectory of the upcoming review. It is a notable fact about institutions that they sometimes change when they are less convinced by logic than by the spectacle of people being plainly human. Auditor Primus arranged the formal challenge as the outline of the finale demanded. It was a tribal thing, a ceremony to be performed with putty-like solemnity, the tribunal of precedent. There would be evidence, witnesses, and a decision made in a room where policy memos were the new altarpieces and the rustle of paper was the ancient liturgy. At the end of the day, the office was quieter. The teapot had been drained of its optimism. Norman sat at his desk and looked at the little stapler as if it now had the face of a small, expectant animal. He wrote the day's minutes with a steady hand and, for once, a steadiness that did not feel like denial. The revelations had not solved anything, precisely. They had made available the possibility of a solution that was not purely abstract. They had shown that mistakes, once admitted, could be remedied in ways that honored the people harmed. Mr. Enoch, who spent most of his day making the literal and metaphysical flaws less alarming to walk upon, rubbed his thumb along the brass handle of his mop in a motion so habitual it might have been prayer. He leaned on the mop and spoke to Norman in a voice that had the timbre of old lullabies. "Sometimes the floor needs scouring," he said. "Sometimes you sweep up what you can't see and find lost names." Norman wanted to ask 1,000 questions about how the mop knew things, about why Mitta. Enoch always had the right tool for the metaphorical emergency. Instead, he simply nodded. It is a small, underrated thing to be understood without being explained. Outside, in the world that had been hiccuping in polite fits, one town went on humming in 3-part harmony, and a city found its clocks running slightly slow on Tuesdays. Small anomalies remained, the aftertaste of a near ending. But in the clean, fluorescent light of the department, something else had happened. The people who kept the machine had shown the machine that they, too, were complicated and fallible, and that those very human qualities were part of the evidence that would be presented against the cold assertion that the world should be allowed to end because a form had been completed incorrectly. The room settled into a different kind of resolve. There would be hearings, there would be testimony, and, perhaps, a theatrical stubbornness from Auditor Primus. But there was also a change in what they could offer, not only legal argument, but the very messy, unseemly particulars of lives. Those particulars might not defeat procedure on their own. They might not, in fact, course a perfectly objecting directorate into tenderness. But they could tilt the scales. Norman locked his drawer with the small key he kept for superstition. For the first time in years, the small smudge at the corner of his margin seemed less like an accusation and more like a map. He walked down the corridor with Rita and Tom and Aria, their footsteps making a pattern of small percussion. They were not triumphant. They were threatened. They were, however, accompanied by the ancient, unquantifiable thing that keeps people upright through absurdity, each other's company. The chapter closed on a sound that had been heard more and more often lately, a distant, increasingly insistent ticking that was not in the clocks. It was the clockwork of decision, the gear teeth of audit engaging. The directorate was preparing a formal courtroom-like review. Files would be called. Witnesses would stand. The sprint was on the horizon, a thing that demanded paper, courage, and the sort of improvisational bravery Norman had never permitted himself before. And as the lights in the department dimmed to a polite low, Norman found that his hands trembled, not with fear but with a kind of nervous, hopeful readiness. Something like a new kind of marginalia had been written across the day: confession, discovery, advocacy, and accountability. He had, through small errors and greater truths, become part of the evidence that might save the world. They would need to run. They would need to print, to notarize, to file, and to do all the things a life or death bureaucracy requires when it is suddenly faced with less simple math and more human beings. The sprint toward triplicate copies, signatures, witnesses, and improbable office supply barters was not yet underway. It waited for the next morning, for the heat of urgency when paper becomes sanctified by desperation. For now, in the hush of the department, Norman folded his notes and placed them under the tiny stapler. He looked out at the city where clocks hiccuped and people hummed off-key, and for the first time since he'd been misfiled and miswitnessed by fate, he felt less like a clerk compounded of small failures and more like a person who might, with friends and with contrition, learn to unclench the neatness that had held his life like a rigid corset. He turned his collar up against the fluorescent air, and when the kettle coughed for the last time that night, he smiled a little. There would be reckonings tomorrow, and then, perhaps, a sprint. The hook lingered like a post-it note on a file folder. There would be an official review. There would be procedures deployed like armor, and they would be ready to run, to push paper through presses, to perform the awkward, hopeful gymnastics of saving the world by slightly bending the rules. It would be, as everything in that office always proved to be, absurd, earnest, and utterly human.